BibleWorm, reading the Bible with BibleWorm.
Welcome to BibleWorm, getting to the core of the biblical text. I'm Dr. Amy Robertson, Director of Lifelong Learning at Congregation Or Hadash in Sandy Springs, Georgia.
And I'm Dr. Robert Williamson, Professor of Religious Studies at Hendrix College and the founding pastor of Mercy Community Church in Little Rock. We're here every week to discuss the biblical text, both as biblical scholars and as people of faith, one Jewish and one Christian.
Today we are reading John chapter 20, verses 19 to 31, the last text we will read together in the book of John. We sit for a long while with the question, what does it mean for the disciples to be sent into the world by Jesus in the way that Jesus was sent into the world by the Father? We give doubting Thomas some love, lifting up his bravery, and really seeing the bravery it takes to hang in there through moments of doubt and to speak what you need out loud. And we step back to look at the role this gospel might imagine itself to have in someone else's life of faith. It is not the beginning and the end, but more like a starter pack or a reserve to tap when you need it, because we will all have our own story. Thanks for being with us. Hey, Bobby, how are you?
Hey, Amy, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good.
I find it helps if you sing a song about how good you're doing.
The other day, I was taking my kids into school, and we're like in the car. And when I've just lost patience waiting for them, sometimes I'm like, I'm going to wait in the car because I know I'm going to blow my top if I stay in the house and watch how unbelievably slowly teenagers move.
Yeah.
So I was sitting in the car, and one of the kids gets in the car, and I'm singing myself a song. And she was like, why are you so happy? And I was like, I'm not happy. I'm trying to prevent myself from blowing up our entire family unit with my rage. But I realized that it actually is, I think, confused. They think that I actually am happy. I'm not happy. I'm trying to survive the morning.
That's interesting. So then they would do the behaviors that lead to your being enraged if they want to make you happy. Like, what would Mom most appreciate today? I know.
Mom
Let's
likes it
drag
when we
our
move
feet
as slow as humanly possible.
Yeah.
That makes her really happy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Mm-hmm.
We have moved past the crucifixion and the first sightings of Jesus after the resurrection.
We have, yeah.
We have, yeah.
Spring has sprung. Jesus has risen. And onward we go. Into new life. Yeah.
That's right. So we are in John chapter 20, once again, just picking up one verse after where we left off last time. The reading today is verses 19 through 31 from the book of John. Do you want to remind us where we're coming from? What just happened? I mean, again, I don't know how much background we need because we just left off the verse before.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing I think is just that we're still, as you'll see when you start reading, we're still on Easter Sunday. And so we've just, what's happened just before this is Mary has lingered at the tomb after Peter and the other disciple have left and Jesus has spoken to her. She's gone home and given her testimony to the other disciples, I've seen the Lord. And then this is going to take place later that same day. So, it's been a week since we talked about that text, but in narrative time, it's been a matter of hours.
Yep.
So all of this information about resurrection, still brand new.
Yep. Brand spanking new. Great. So I am reading from the NRSV, and I think I'll just dive in. You ready?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So picking up in verse 19. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." That's really not a COVID-friendly
No.
Now come here and I'm going to breathe on you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a different time.
It was a different time. I was at a birthday the other day and there were candles on the cake and somebody blew out the candles. And I was like,
oh, wow.
I haven't seen that in 2 years. Like, that's kind of weird. Like, yeah, breathing has become a whole different kind of thing in the last couple of years.
I thought we'd be done with that, like, as a culture. I guess we're not done.
I guess not.
No.
I guess not.
No, we're not.
Yeah.
One of my little nephews, when he was very small, like, not a logical human yet, his favorite game that he always wanted to play, which was gross even before COVID, was coughing in each other's mouths because he liked the feeling of the air. Okay, that's enough. That's not what we're talking about.
This
here.
is not probably what John was hoping we would talk about.
Not what John was
but
hoping we would talk about.
you gotta connect to your own life somehow.
Right, there we go. That'll preach. Okay, so as you said, it's still Sunday. It's evening now on Sunday. So this all started when it was sort of still dark out, pre-dawn hours.
Yeah.
And now it's evening on Sunday. I was surprised at the reference of like the doors of the house where the disciples had met. Even just that phrase, I guess I hadn't quite pictured the disciples as a group that held meetings, as being sort of like seeing themselves as an entity unto themselves. Do you have any sense of whether, like, I don't know, does that surprise you? Or do you think it was like in the face of their teacher's death, they gathered because that's what you do when someone dies? Or
yeah, that's such an interesting question. There's actually a lot packed into that verse even. The first thing that I would say is that the word house is not actually in the Greek anywhere, although it's imported in a lot of English translations like the NRSV. The CEB, I think, actually gets it a little more accurately, which is the disciples were behind closed doors. So the doors are there, but the house actually isn't. I don't know if that matters. But, in my mind, the door then can kind of become metaphorical. We remember Jesus saying in chapter 10, like, I am the door, I am the gate. And so then it becomes more of like they're closed off to understanding or they're closed off to the relationship more than it becomes like we're all together in a physical house. That said, the only other reference I can really think of to the disciples gathering, I mean, of course, there's the supper, which they had together in the farewell discourse. And then we also got the notice when they went to the garden on the last night of Jesus's life, that was a place where they frequently gathered. And so there does seem to be some kind of group that has some kind of identity that they get together. I don't know how big that group is or how many, like where's the boundary of who's part of that and not part of that group.
Yeah.
But there does seem to be at least some sort of group that has gathered along the way.
That's really helpful because I think that, I was aware of those gatherings, but I think so much of the disciples' relationships in those prior get-togethers as like each one is connected to Jesus, like he's the center of the wheel, and there are these like spokes going out. And I hadn't thought much about their relationship to each other, but I guess this is precisely what's happening at this moment in the story is that, once Jesus is not here on earth to play that teacher-leader role in the way that he has, they need to figure out how to regroup if they hadn't, quite had relationships that weren't mediated by Jesus before. It's time.
That's a really helpful way of thinking about that, Amy. It was reminding me of my family. Like my grandfather died when my dad was really young. And so my grandmother was like the matriarch of the family, and everybody, like all her 4 kids and all of their kids and all of their kids, like 50 or 60 people got together at her house, like, Christmas and Easter and maybe Mother's Day, like 3 or 4 times a year, like 50 people would all gather. And she lived to be 100. And I remember along the way, people would say, we don't know what's going to happen when grandmother dies. Are we still all going to see each other? And it was this really kind of interesting question about when you're all connected to that one person, what happens when that one person is gone?
Right.
I mean, what happened in our family was we kept all getting together. And so, like, that's also what seems to be happening here. But it's really interesting to think about that shift. I appreciate you putting that point on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting moment for them. I feel like this is a little bit of a broken record thing to say, but I'll point it out because every time we might as well point it out every time.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing that the CEB there has translated, instead of fear of the Jews, fear of the Jewish authorities.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The more we read it, the more I'm like, that just seems so important to me to differentiate.
Yeah. No, I appreciate your saying that. And, we've seen that all along the way. But every time you got to keep saying it. We've seen people be afraid of the authorities before. We saw the family of the man who was born blind. They were afraid of the Jewish authorities because they didn't want to get kicked out of the synagogue. We've seen that kind of differentiation. Jewish people, and the disciples are Jewish people who are afraid. And so afraid of the Jews doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Afraid of the religious authorities is what makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're exactly right. That gets misunderstood all the time.
For good reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
because those are the words that are in the NRSV.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's right. And I mean, John uses Jews, and we have to kind of tease out what John is really after.
Okay, and then we get the surprise arrival of Jesus.
Yeah.
Who I think walked through the wall?
Yeah.
Or do you think that is that what you understand to be happening, or you think it doesn't matter to John?
How does the NRSV read?
Let's see. The doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked. Jesus came and stood among them.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that you've only got a few options there. One is he walked through the wall.
Yeah.
One is that he sort of materialized out of the air.
Oh, yeah.
If you follow metaphorically, like I was saying before, they're behind closed doors. Jesus is the door. Like doors. I think the point is doors don't matter to Jesus.
That's a really nice way of putting it, instead of I'm creating some like sci-fi novel over here.
Well, I mean, that's what your brain wants to do, though. It wants to picture, if you were directing the movie of this, like how would Jesus appear there? I think that's a totally legit question.
Well, and I think because we're again in this really like liminal space between like, living an embodied existence and not, and he's resurrected in his body, but his body's not necessarily behaving quite like my body does. And
yeah
no,
that's a fair point, and we talked about that a little bit. I think it was last time.
I think we did.
And what is the nature of Jesus's body? And it's not entirely clear.
Yeah,
it's clearly not exactly like your body and my body. It is some sort of a transformed. He still seems to be embodied, but it's some transformed body he's in.
Yeah. I'm really interested in this. I guess it's not quite an analogy, but this statement that Jesus makes to the disciples, as the Father has sent me, so I send you.
Yeah.
Like I picture those like SAT practice analogy questions with the little like colon between the different terms. So as the Father is to me, as I am to you.
Yeah.
Can we like spin out that resonance a little? Like what is the relationship, as far as we know, between the Father and Jesus that is here being extended another level?
Yeah, I mean, I love the way you asked that question. When you start digging down into that, it becomes really profound really quickly. Like if you don't think about it in those terms, it's just like, well, God sent me to the world, and so now I'm sending you into the world, which is, I mean, that's still profound in its own way. But to say God is sending me, as God sent me, I send you. And then you think, well, how did God send Jesus?
Yeah.
And it was, Jesus was in heaven with God, and God sent Jesus into the world incarnated. And so now Jesus would be saying something like, you've been with me this whole time, and now I'm sending you into the world incarnated. And then there becomes something about the bodily presence of the disciples, the believers among the world. You've got to be out there with people in the way that Jesus gave up equality with God to come be among people. You've got to give up being centrality of a disciple to go out in the world as well.
I love that. And there was something about the way that you said that I can't remember what the exact turn of phrase was, but it like pulled out so beautifully that next statement in there that he breathed on them. There's this like, breathing new life into them, just as, Adam has breath breathed into him in Genesis.
Yeah.
It seems so, it's just so reverberant. Like it's so much more, I think, than just saying like, God sent me and I'm sending you.
Yeah. You tossed out that Genesis 2 reference kind of casually.
Yeah.
But I think it's a super important reference. I think that's exactly what John is after. And I really think he breathed into them might be a better understanding than he breathes on them. And that captures that Genesis idea. Here's the clay figurines that God has molded, and then God breathes life into them. Now Jesus breathing the Spirit. So these disciples become inspirited, and then it's a new creation. Like, to me, that's so important. They are in this moment, like in that little breathing moment, they became something different than they were, 10 seconds earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is pretty crazy. That's pretty
crazy. Yeah.
The other thing I thought of as I was trying to pull out this, analogy is that Jesus brings some godliness into the world. Like Jesus has, as part of his self, some bit of God.
Yeah.
And so then I was thinking about how the people who go forth then have some bit of Jesus.
Yeah.
As, the church as like the body of, the church is the body. I don't know. There's a lot in there, just in that one little statement.
There's a lot in there. And as I probably know from our reading of Paul along the way, that is exactly the metaphor that Paul uses. The church is the body of Christ in the world. And I think John is after something kind of like that. That, here's the Spirit that's been breathed into them. We also talked about in the living water passages that, when you drink from the living water that Jesus offers, you yourself become a source of living water for others. We've seen different versions of this image along the way, that there is something now in you as a believer that is not of yourself, but that comes from God, that then is overflowing, that is shareable, that can be breathed onto others. I think that's really important. The other thing that's in that about, as the Father sent me, so I am sending you. If you think about how exactly did God, like what was Jesus sent into the world to do? My head goes back first to John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That there is the source of the commission is love. And so those who are followers of Jesus are in the first instance to be expressions of God's love, not judgment, God's love and desire for reconciliation with the world. The other thing that's in there is that Jesus has said on multiple occasions, none whom the Father has given me will be lost, or something along those lines. And so there is a sense in which now that responsibility is being transferred on to believers, that, our we got to keep people from falling through the cracks and making sure that nobody is left out of the good news of God's reconciling love.
I'm so glad that you brought those two sort of cornerstones up and laid them on the table here. Because the next thing that Jesus says in verse 23 is something else.
Yeah.
If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. That's not how I would have articulated what God sent Jesus into the world to do. How do you think about that verse?
That verse. Oh, that verse. Yeah. It is interesting the way that the Gospel of John thinks, or maybe doesn't think that much about sin. We haven't seen the phrase forgiveness of sins, I think, anywhere in the Gospel of John. From the very beginning, we've been talking about the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, singular. And we've talked along the way about sin in this gospel, not so much about wrongdoing, but about fracture of relationship. Sin means not being in right relationship with God, or something like that. So if you put all of that together and kind of dig around in it, the way that I make sense of this statement is that the world is alienated from God, and God intends reconciliation with the world through reconciling love in Jesus Christ and now in the disciples, and that's your responsibility. So if you can go and reconcile that relationship, which is the forgiveness of sins, then that is done. And if you don't do it, then it's not going to get done. And so it puts kind of a fine. It's not about judgment, right? You get to decide who is good and bad. It is incumbent upon you to restore right relationship. And to the extent that you don't do that, it's not going to be done. I don't know though. Where do you go with that?
I mean, I like that. And I feel like I could see that in the text for the second part. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained.
Yeah.
It feels like a little bit of a harder fit for if you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven, because of the specific word forgive, not if you wipe away or something like that. But otherwise, it seems to come a little bit out of left field that this is their charge.
Yeah, I agree with that. And if you back up from my sort of theological reading of it, and you just say, what if in fact Jesus is just giving people power to decide who is and isn't forgiven? It's interesting then to think about, like, what would people do with that power, right? Like, I know people who would think, like, oh my gosh, now I get to, like, get back at all the people I hate, right? Like, heck with you, person I don't like, I'm not forgiving your sins. And then, you have control over their, like, eternal soul. There are other people I know who would see that power and think, oh my goodness, like, that is such good news. Like, I could forgive everybody, and like everybody would be forgiven. And so it's just kind of interesting to me to think about, like, what kind of person am I if that's my charge, and what kind of person, what kind of people are we?
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about. I know the disciples are there because they are followers and people of faith, and they're flawed, and they're like the stories of disciples in this gospel are not like they're these superhuman beings. So I think that's an interesting thing to sit with too, as especially for people who are listening, who are leaders of religious communities, and what kind of power do you sort of have whether you want it or not?
Yeah.
And how do we hold that power?
Yeah.
Knowing that we're none of us are superhuman folks. We just do the best we can with what we got.
Like, to me, if you read that and you recognize what you just said about we are flawed human beings, and you take John 3:16, that God is coming into the world not in judgment but in love, then you think, okay, the way to mess that up, like, if I'm going to mess that up, which I am, the best way to enter into that situation is to just forgive and love everybody. You know what I mean? Like, if I'm going to err on one side or the other, I'm going to mess it up by being too merciful.
Yeah.
Which I think is what John is kind of saying God is like, but is not always, maybe not even often, the way we represent God in the world, many of us.
Yeah. Okay. One of the disciples wasn't there yet. Should we go on and read about him, or do you want to say anything else about this first part?
There's just one other detail in here that I think is important, and it's going to show up again in this next section that you're going to read, but when Jesus shows up, he says, "Peace be with you," which I think is interesting of its own accord. But then the next thing he does is show them his hands and his side where they have been pierced by the nails and by the sword. That little detail, it's not enough for Jesus just to say, "Hey, here I am," but like, "Hey, here I am, and here are my wounds."
Yeah.
Do you have ways of thinking about the importance of the wounds?
The way you phrase that question just like spun everything like 35 degrees to the left for me. So now it's like everything is sort of reshifted. What I was gonna say initially was, I think it's really interesting in here that we don't even know if the disciples recognized him. We don't know if we have all these other stories, of Mary just recently not realizing it was Jesus. So we don't know if they need to see his hands and his side to realize that it's Jesus, or if they need to see his hands and his side to realize this wasn't all a dream. That terrible crucifixion really did happen, and I am still in that body. The specific nature of the miracle that they're witnessing. But when you just asked it in terms of show me your wounds, I don't know, it felt a lot broader and less concrete, a lot more like, leading with your vulnerabilities, like that kind of honesty. Like we're going to start right there.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other direction to take that in.
Yeah. And probably, the way you ask questions often is, grows out of your own sort of answer to whatever the question is. And I think that's probably true in this case. I definitely think the sort of like, they need to see that this is real. I think that's definitely part of it. But I do think it's interesting that it doesn't say they saw the Lord until after Jesus shows them his wounds.
Yeah.
And so there's something here about you can't actually recognize Jesus apart from his woundedness. And so it is the marks of execution by the empire that it's necessary for that to be part of the conversation, part of the witness, and that Jesus has now been resurrected. He still bears those marks, and yet here he is alive. And I love where you take that. The next step is to say that then if we are to be incarnated in that way, then we also could lead with our wounds and say, look, I've been wounded by the empire and I've survived, and that opens up a whole world of the way we interact, the way we bear witness. I really love that.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Maynard O'Connell, pastor of Park Hill Presbyterian Church in North Little Rock, Arkansas, USA, and I am a BibleWorm supporter at the Bible Study Liturgy Worm level. I had finally decided that I was ready to work with the narrative lectionary when the pandemic hit. And then over that summer, I realized that several of the resources I was planning to use had shuttered. I was pretty upset, but I turned to BibleWorm and quickly realized that not only could I benefit from Bobby and Amy's fantastic exegesis and Bible study, but that I had found a community as well. I appreciate not only having colleagues from across the globe to think and study with, but also to be able to share the Bible study with a small class at my church. And the liturgy has literally been a lifesaver. It's the best use of my continuing education fund yet. I hope you'll consider becoming a BibleWorm supporter too. You can join for as little as $4 a month. Just go to patreon.com/BibleWorm podcast for details. And now, back to this week's podcast.
Okay, I have some more questions about how the disciples interact with Jesus, but I think I want to read about Thomas first and then fold them into that.
Okay, sounds
good.
Is that okay?
To me. All right.
Yeah.
So I'm picking up in verse 24. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe."
Yeah.
poor Thomas was out getting a Sprite.
Yeah.
He missed
It's interesting, the question about like where was Thomas and why was he there?
Yeah.
Because that's one way of reading it is, well, he was just like, he was late, or he was just like, wasn't that invested?
Took a phone call.
Thomas is, he's often read that way. But, the reason that they're there behind closed doors is because they're afraid. And so I think it's equally possible to read Thomas as actually being the brave one in the group who is out in the world doing his thing because he's not afraid of what's going to happen to him. Isn't he the one that back in when they go to see Lazarus in John 11, isn't he the one who said, let's go do this? Everybody else was saying, if you go, they're going to kill you. And
yeah. Yes, it was Thomas in John 11 who said, let us also go that we may die with him.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we've seen in chapter 11 that he's not afraid to be out in the world, even though his life's in danger. And then maybe that's what's happening here again. He's the bravest of the disciples, willing to risk his life. I mean, we don't know what he's doing out there.
Right, we don't know what he's doing, but we don't need to assume that he is, up to no good or slacking on his disciple duties
disciple.
or
That's right.
the slacker disciple.
He gets a bad rap. People almost always call him Doubting Thomas. I'm like, okay, like he's going to have some doubts here, but come on. Like he did some other things too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it seems like sort of an apples to oranges comparison.
Yeah.
Because the other disciples, as we were saying, we don't know if they would have believed or recognized Jesus. Like Jesus just leads with showing them, leads with the visual confirmation. Yeah. And so they don't have any chance to even think about like, do we believe or not believe, or what do we think is happening? Like it seems to unfold really quickly. So when they tell Thomas, we have seen the Lord, I don't know if the other disciples were so much more believing. I just feel like we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because they've already got the evidence that he's asking for. He just wants the same thing they got.
Yeah. Well, he also wants to touch it.
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
But
fair enough.
Yeah. But I mean, or that could have been it could be one of those things where the other disciples said, like, we saw this and it sounds so crazy that, it's like when hell freezes over, such and such, I'll believe whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm so curious in this narrative whether Thomas, all the disciples are recorded here saying to him is, we've seen the Lord. And so I'm so curious whether they told him about the wounds or whether he came up with that on his own. Like he had some sort of intuition about like, that's what really matters.
That's true. Their statement is very vague.
It is.
It's very vague.
It does. Their statement is, Mary Magdalene at the end of the Easter text, after Jesus has revealed himself to her, she comes back and says to the disciples, I've seen the Lord. And now then when they say we've seen the Lord, that's the same report she made. Mm-hmm. Just now it's a group instead of just her. But that seems to be the report that you make when you have realized what's happened.
Yeah.
You say, I or we have seen the Lord. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. It leaves a lot open.
It does.
It seems significant, maybe more significant to me that like he doesn't get breathed on. Does that come up, or do we just sort of brush
I've never thought about that before, Amy. Yeah. I've never thought about that before.
Well, then I guess it doesn't come up later. Which is almost interesting in and of itself, that like we might read that and say like that's where the real power is, and that's the sort of quote unquote magical transference of power ritual. But sometimes it doesn't happen and it's still okay. Like
yeah.
I don't know, is it?
Yeah, and I don't know whether the breathing happens to the group. That's an interesting. I'd have to go back and look at that. He breathed
on them.
Yeah. Now I'm wondering whether Jesus went around and like breathed on each of them individually, which I think is probably not what happened, but like he breathes his spirit like into the group of disciples.
Yeah.
If you read it the second way, then if you become joined to the group of disciples, then you are also part of that inspirited body.
Mm-hmm.
I think I like that better than. So each individual person does not necessarily have to receive the breath of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I feel like I'm tracking down some like potential heresies right here. Like
there's a lot of danger of heresy in this conversation.
There is, yeah, and especially when you're talking a little bit on the fly, you never quite know what you're going to trip into.
Yeah, well, we're just thinking aloud. That's all.
Yeah, I like
we're
that.
We're just thinking. And so far, the text doesn't have any opinion about what Thomas says, right? Like John, the narrator, doesn't. At least as far as I can tell. It's just.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any judgment here. And I think there's a question later on in the next section of the text, whether to what extent Thomas is being judged and for what, but not here.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things, by the way, is that the word Thomas means twin. And so it says Thomas, the one also called Didymus. Didymus also means twin. And so it's like, his name is like Twinny Twinnerson or something like that. You know what I mean? Like he's got two names that both mean twin.
That's really weird. Now I keep thinking like, what's another name that means Bobby? But that's not how, we don't really do that anymore.
I don't know.
What does your name mean, Robert?
I don't know. I looked it up once. I don't know. I never know how much stock to put. I could Google it real quick if you want.
I think the people want to know what Robert means.
Dr. Google. What does Robert mean? Bright fame. Here I am with a worm-themed podcast. Like, how much brighter or more famous could you be? A worm-themed Bible podcast host.
That's lovely, Bobby.
Yeah, what does Amy mean?
Just like the word amiable,
beloved.
Yeah.
You are.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Okay, we're beloved.
Both of those are better than Twinny Twinnerson.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
True. So then I'm going to pick up in verse 26. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe."
Yeah.
What do you think that week was like? Like a whole week passed.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a funny question, but it's also a serious question. Like, does he just keep hanging with the disciples I don't know, does it create do you imagine there's some kind of tension or?
That's an interesting question.
They've had really different experiences or they had, rather they all had an experience that Thomas didn't have. So like they're in pretty different places.
It's been long enough now that Thomas has been with them that he hasn't gotten any follow-up. That it's sort of the community has its existence now. It's doing its new thing. And Thomas still hasn't been given anything more. And yet he is still welcomed among them. To me, that's kind of interesting.
Yes.
He's still an unbeliever.
Yeah, he is welcome. He's, as far as we can tell, he's welcome among them. He's still hanging out with them a week later. I just can only imagine that this would have been pretty awkward.
Yeah.
But I think it's powerful that it's a week later and Thomas is still with them.
It says something about him and it says something about them. And I think it also says something about, one of the things that we've seen throughout this gospel is that people come to understanding who Jesus is in different ways and over different periods of time. We saw that with the disciples in the first chapter of John already. We saw it with Nicodemus in John 3, and then he shows up again and again with the woman at the well. Now we've got Mary who has seen Jesus at the garden, and then we've got disciples who have seen Jesus and seen his wounds. We've got Thomas who hasn't yet come to believe. And so there is something here about the diversity of experience and not assuming that everyone has to have exactly the same experience in order to become part of the community.
I think that is so important because, while Jesus does say, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. So yes, okay. So it would have been great if you hadn't needed that. He also gives Thomas exactly what Thomas said he needed.
Yeah.
Which was more than he had given the other disciples.
Yeah.
Thomas really is met he's met exactly where he is. And I think that's really powerful. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, that line that you were talking about, happy are those who don't see and yet believe. There isn't a sort of an implied judgment there, but it doesn't actually say happier than or more blessed that are. It just says, you believe. Did you believe because you saw me? Happy are those who believe even though they didn't see me. And so, maybe Jesus is saying, I wish you could have believed without seeing. But I think what you're saying about he gave Thomas exactly what he needed without scolding him for it. He just said, you asked for this and here you go. And then I think there's going to come a time, he is suggesting, when people in future generations are not going to have the option of just sort of seeing me show up once I've been ascended. And so those people also are going to be blessed and happy, even though they're not going to have access to this.
Yeah.
I like to try to read that without a better or worse, or just difference.
And it's making me think too, I really like that. And it's making me think, it's making me wonder again about what that week was like in between his statement of doubt and when he gets this confirmation that maybe there was not necessarily strife between him and the community, but it would have been easier for him. Not that he could have just turned a switch and believed, but it would have been easier on him if he hadn't, had that week of doubt and unknowing and tension. So but maybe it is a matter of fact statement that it is a great and blessed thing to believe without seeing.
Yeah.
Do you make anything much from Thomas's response after he has this opportunity to physically confirm that it's Jesus as he had wanted? He says, "My Lord and my God."
Yeah.
I guess I would have expected just my Lord, or I don't know. What do you make of that twofold naming?
I have so many thoughts about it.
I want to hear them all.
Yeah.
All your thoughts. Not all of them. You start and I'll tell you when to stop. No, I'm just kidding. I want to hear all your thoughts.
I think that's exactly the right question. Why does he say it that way, and why are there two different affirmations there? I've got three different ways of thinking about this.
Okay, I'm ready. Number one,
it's about incarnation. So my Lord is a way that you would refer to your human superior person that, has responsibility for you. And God is a way, obviously, of referring to the deity. And so to say my Lord and my God is a way of acknowledging kind of the fullness of who Jesus is, both God and human.
Okay, so if we go with that, then he does better than the other disciples who just say they saw the Lord. Then he ups things a little bit. Okay, great. I love it.
Way number two.
Yeah.
In a post-colonial reading, one might suggest that the terms Lord and God were terms that were reserved for Caesar, or at least were attributed to Caesar, who is both understood to be the patron of all patrons, so the Lord of all lords, and also often claimed to have divine status. And so for Thomas to say to Jesus, "You are my Lord and my God," is attributing the titles of Caesar to somebody who is not Caesar, and therefore is a counter-imperial claim.
I like it.
You do not seem entirely convinced by that
No,
one.
I started thinking, you got my brain going in a different direction, but I'm going to hold my tongue until you finish. Number three.
Number three is a distinctively Jewish way of thinking about what's happening here. And it's related to the names of God in the Hebrew Bible. You probably know more about this than I do, but here's my version of it. God is called two different things in the Hebrew scripture, as you well know, Elohim and Adonai. So Elohim, God, Adonai, Lord. And so my God, my Lord is acknowledging both of those names of God. In the rabbinic tradition, when the question comes up, why are there two different names for God in the Hebrew scriptures? One of the answers is these are ways of naming two different characteristics of God. If I recall correctly, Elohim, God, manifests God's judgment in the rabbinic interpretation, and Adonai, Lord, manifests God's mercy in rabbinic interpretation. And so to say my Lord and my God is to say Jesus is the one who encompasses both judgment and mercy witnessed to by the God of the Hebrew scripture. Does that sound right? Reasonable?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it's so funny, reading this in English or in Greek instead of in Hebrew. Like my mind just doesn't go to that place. But yes, of course, there are in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, there are stories that are told where the God is called Elohim, and there are stories that are told where the God is called Adonai. And then there's like the central, Jews don't really talk about a creed, but if we did, it would be probably the Shema, which is Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Like the Lord is our God. Lord and God are one. There's one, and it's both of them. These are not two separate entities. So I really like the idea of Thomas making a similar statement.
Yeah, I love that. And, if we imagine that Christians in the first century were reading the Hebrew scriptures actually in the Septuagint Greek, then that language you wouldn't have actually had to translate all of that. These are actually the words, Elohim is theos and Adonai is kurios. And so those words just come straight out of the Greek version of the Hebrew scripture.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot.
Now, I don't know, we just put a lot of weight on one little sentence from Thomas, but I think there's so much when he says, my Lord and my God, like there is so much in there. And your point that he's done better than the others, I think is a really important point because nobody in John's gospel has said my God to Jesus. Yeah. They've said my Lord before, but not my God.
Yeah.
And so Thomas, despite kind of coming belatedly, ultimately gets it more close to the mark than anybody else.
Yeah. I'm not sure what exactly it was that you said when you were describing your approaches to that line, but something got me thinking back again to John chapter 11 that we were talking about before, when Jesus says to his disciples, we need to go back to Judea. And they say, you've lost your mind. We're going to get killed if we go to Judea. And Thomas says, we're going with you, and we can die with him. Like this is yes, it's dangerous, and yes, we're gonna go. And it just had me thinking, if it is his belief that like death, the threat of death is real, and he's willing to face that death. I don't know, something about like his understanding the death of Jesus as real and permanent.
Yeah.
Even if it was incorrect.
Yeah.
It like elevates even more so to me the bravery that he showed, or the bravery and loyalty that he showed in chapter 11 to say like death is real and permanent, and we're here with you. We're going with you.
Yeah.
And so it's not the same as saying, death has lost its sting. Like death very much has a sting, but not to let that sting be the driver of your decisions is an enormously like powerful way to live in the world. So I think I just want to give some more props to Thomas. Like, his course of development here has been different, but he's an interesting character. And I like him.
He very much is. Amy, I appreciate your saying that so much because it's taken me back to other conversations that we've had several times in the past few weeks, where we talked about Jesus told his disciples not to follow him, and Peter did follow. Peter struck the slave's ear, and then Peter followed and denied. And we had several conversations along the way about death, and to the extent that you think death is the end, you're going to lose your nerve, which maybe Thomas didn't actually in chapter 11, which is kind of interesting. But when you read this issue that we've been talking about with you've got to see the marks on his hands and his side to know, Jesus said, you don't understand now, but you'll understand later. Now, maybe now's the later where it's, yes, I died. And look, the marks of death are in my body. And yet I'm now alive.
Yeah.
So now on this side of the resurrection, maybe the point of seeing those marks is, before Thomas was brave despite knowing death was the end. And now maybe has been a transformation where now that life is more powerful than death. Not to say that you're not going to die, but to say that death is not the end of that story, that it does inspire another kind of possibility.
Yeah. I love that. And it makes doubting Thomas a little more complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Thomas is, I think there's a lot to like about Thomas.
All right, we have just 2 more verses. Are you ready to go on?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to pick up in verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. It's like a little postscript.
Yeah, I think that does read kind of like a postscript. And it's interesting because it reads like the end of the book, and yet there's another chapter to go. So some people have thought that maybe this was an original ending to the book or an ending to a source within the book.
That's interesting. I could see that.
But it's also really relevant right at this exact moment when we've just had this whole conversation about what is it going to take for you to believe. Like, if you waited a chapter to say this kind of thing, then, it wouldn't ring quite as true as when you read it right here after this interaction with Thomas.
Okay, I love that framing, and I'm going to ask you the question that I had planned to ask you, but you've already sort of started to answer it, I think. Why report that Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples who we're told already believe? Like, why is he still doing signs for them? I mean, it seems like not to be for our benefit because it doesn't tell us what they were.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a question about when did Jesus do these other miraculous signs? And I never really thought about it this way, but you're sort of reading it as right sort of here and
I
now.
am. I'm reading it as after. Signs. You're right, but it doesn't say it was after.
I've always read this as like in his lifetime, he did lots of stuff, and we just wrote down some of them.
A little sampling.
Which we thought would be sufficient unto your belief. Yeah.
Huh.
In either case, it's interesting that signs are seen as being necessary for belief when throughout the whole gospel, Jesus has been kind of irritated that people need signs in order to believe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, but also sort of maybe begrudgingly acknowledging that this seems to be the case.
That's true. That is true. Maybe I wish human beings were different than you are, but I know this is how you are, and so this is what I'm going to give you. Yeah. I've always read this as like, look, these ones that we've given you are really pretty amazing. And if you still have doubts, like there were so many more things that I could have told you, just didn't do it. So it's sort of like, it's like there is an abundance. There's an abundance of evidence. It's so interesting that, this is like the breaking of the fourth wall, like when you're watching a sitcom or whatever, and they look into the camera and they start talking to you as the audience. Like that's what's happening right here. Suddenly we're being addressed directly so that you will believe. And you're like, me?
How did you know I was here?
Yeah. It's just such an interesting move. And so like, you've kind of had the sense that, that's been the whole point of the Gospel of John is like telling us things so that we will believe. And then now here is, the curtain is pulled back. And in fact, that's exactly what's been going on. I do think it's interesting though, Because I feel like where we've sort of been moving since January has been something like we have to believe the testimony of others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we all have to have our own experiences that we make our own.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever that experience is, like, the exact nature of your experience doesn't matter that much. It's just that you come to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this doesn't contradict that in any kind of a way, because it is saying, like, look, here's the testimony of one believer who is the gospel writer John, who is drawing on other testimonies. And so here's their testimony, and then you have your own experience and the testimony of others. But it does seem to put a little bit more weight on this gospel as the sort of source of belief or the instigator of belief than where I thought we were headed until we got to right here.
Yeah. Okay, so as we've already recognized, I read this as referring to doing signs, right there in that moment, or in pretty close proximity to the passage we just finished. So that probably is not the right reading, but either way, reading this section had me thinking about an interview that I heard with the new head of the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Mm-hmm.
And she was saying, I can't remember what the question was that was posed to her, but she was saying that rabbinical school is not really job training to be a rabbi, which is probably true of most jobs. Like, you get all kinds of education and then you have to figure out how to do the job once you start the job. But that it's there to dig a deep well and fill it as much as you can so that when the work is hard, you have a center to come back to and some memories and some sort of like a deep embodied memory of what, faith and comfort and connection can be. And then eventually maybe your work also starts filling your well, but like that you have to have the faith in the first place to start down that path.
Yeah.
And then what they're giving you is not exactly training for the next step, but it's like sort of this acknowledgement that like the next step is going to be really hard.
Yeah.
Like living as a follower of Jesus in this community that's being described in this text, when Jesus is no longer here on earth with them, that's going to be hard.
Yeah.
So maybe some of the bonus signs were like, I don't know, just to dig their well a little deeper, even if they didn't need it to believe in that moment that, I don't know, there's some recognition that you're going to need some reserves.
I love that, Amy. I think there's a lot to that. Kind of no matter where you place the, like, when did the miracles occur? This idea that the reservoir is deeper than the bit you've been given here. Like, there is more there. And that also helps me make sense of what I was just asking a little bit ago. Because, like, the testimonies of believers throughout time since the writing of the gospel is also stuff that could be added, So this is sort of saying you've got to start someplace. Like, come and see has been a theme in this gospel. And so here's a starting place for you. And here's a framework in which you can interpret your own experience. If you have experience, but you don't have any understanding of like how this is played out for other people, then you can't make sense of what's happening to you.
Yeah.
And so here it is. And until you have your own belief, like here you can believe on the basis of these stories. And on the mornings that you have doubt, as Thomas had doubt, you can go back and have these stories. I really love that. And it draws the tradition back together instead of saying, here's the gospel. So this is all you need. It's saying, here's the gospel as a starting point for this difficult thing that's going to take more than just this.
And it's interesting for me to think about this, some of this as like sort of job training for the job of how are you going to start a church, people?
Yeah.
Like, you got some big work to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you going to need to sustain you through that?
Yeah. This also pushes me back to that line that we were talking about earlier where Jesus says to Thomas, blessed are the ones, or happy are the ones who don't see and yet believe. Because like now that the gospel is addressing me, then it's clearer to say like, oh, that's me. He's talking about me, right? Like I'm the blessed one, the reader of the gospel who don't have the benefit, at least most of us, of Jesus showing up and saying, here's my body and my wounds. And so we have to believe without seeing. And so it does kind of give you a little more sense of, it's an acknowledgement that this is a hard thing and that maybe Thomas couldn't do it and maybe the disciples couldn't do it. But there's a sense in which, maybe we can do it.
Well, this has been a beautiful and complex passage. I feel like there's a lot. Sometimes we read and I'm like, I don't know what people are going to preach on in here.
Yeah.
But I think there are a lot of nice possibilities in here.
Yeah, I think so.
What's really coming to the front for you?
I think where my energy has been drawn is to the conversation we were having way back at the very beginning of this text when Jesus says, is that analogy, as the Father sent me, so I am sending you. And just the way that we were sort of digging through, like, well, what are the implications of that? And then sort of paired up with if you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you don't forgive them, they aren't forgiven. This is the sort of Great Commission in John's gospel. Matthew gives us a very different one, but this is what Jesus tells the disciples to do. Peace be with you, and then I'm sending you the way I was sent. I think there's something really important about that. And this idea of incarnation we were talking about, that the way that Jesus loved the world, or the way that God loved the world in Jesus, was to become incarnate among them. And I think there is a clear imperative for followers of the gospel, for believers in Jesus, to also be incarnated in the world in love. And so to come into the world with a posture of love for the world and a desire to reconcile the world and be a part of it. You made a comment. I can't even remember which podcast it is. I think maybe it was chapter 12, but where Jesus loved them as his own, and that sense of the shift that we were talking about then, as it went from like there's an object out there which is the world which God loves, to in the incarnation God comes to be part of the world which he now loves as his own. And so if we take that and import it into this sort of analogy of as I sent you, or as God sent me, so I send you, then it is, don't treat your neighbor as an object who's out there, who is an object of your love, but actually become incarnate amongst your neighbors and become one of them, know what it's like to be them, and then love them from the inside instead of from the outside. And I think that's a really, like, if we could achieve that as sort of, this is the way the church is in the world, I think that would be amazing. I think that would be transformational for us and for our neighbors as well. That draws me back to that notion. We've struggled at least I have, all the way along with the balance between mercy and judgment in John's gospel. And it comes right to a point in this: forgive people's sins and they're forgiven, don't and they're not. And I really think there is something about that. If you become incarnate in the world and you understand the people and come to love them as your own, then your orientation toward them is going to be forgiveness. It's not going to be judgment.
Yes.
And so if you can actually become incarnate, then you will know how to love in the way that God loves, which is a merciful and forgiving love, rather than a posture of judgment of the world. So, this text makes me very hopeful about what my faith could be.
Yeah.
A little cynical maybe about how it often is lived out in my own life and in the life of others. But I think there's a really beautiful idea here about what it could mean to be a follower of Jesus.
That's so beautiful, Bobby. And it takes me back, the way you were talking about really loving your neighbor as your own, like as your own self, and being, it takes me back to some of those like kind of mystical images we had in our mind as we were reading the very beginning of these texts, where things that you thought were boundaries and were separate things, like there's a word that comes down, but no, the word is God. It's not a word from God. Yeah. Like everything that you thought was a boundary is not a boundary.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Where does your head go when you read this text?
I don't know whether to be happy with my consistency or disappointed with my creativity. But I think I keep circling around a lot of the same ideas in these last few texts in John. And so this is what's really rising up for me. The role of doubt, the space for doubt that is allowed in this text, that Thomas continues to dwell among these other disciples. And whether it was a little uncomfortable or not, we don't know. But I think it is not so easy to state our doubts and questions in communities of faith, whether that's religious faith or belief in anything. There's a lot of pressure to just quietly not be sure, but carry on behaving as though you're as sure as everyone else is. It's a much easier route to go. But if Thomas hadn't just put it right out there and said, this is what I'm going to need to believe, he wouldn't have gotten what he needed to believe. And now we see later in the text, if he hadn't gotten what he needed to believe, he wouldn't have been the one to put together this, my Lord and my God.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't all expect that kind of response when we say, this is what I need, and now it's going to happen. But this can be at least this is how we want it to be, And I think we need to continue building and rebuilding communities that can hold space for doubt and let people articulate their doubt and see a relationship between faith and doubt, and not just as we're going to tolerate it because we're tolerant people, but
I love that.
Maybe, who knows, maybe some good will come of it.
Yeah, maybe in fact the doubter will understand things we have not understood.
We have not understood. Right, like Mary who was grieving needed to stay at the grave longer, and she, everyone. I just feel like there's so many stories in this text of people doing the thing they need to do. It's not necessarily the paradigmatic right thing to do, but it's just their honest response to what's going on, and that's the thing. If you are honest and earnest in doing what is true for you, it can get you pretty far.
I love that, Amy. And it's making me think about Peter, who unfortunately in the narrative lectionary, we drop Peter's story. This is the last thing we're going to talk about in the Gospel of John. The last time we really saw Peter as a named character. I mean, we saw him running to the tomb, and presumably he believed in that experience. Prior to that, we saw him denying Jesus around the fire where he was sitting with the guards and the officers. In the next chapter, the very last thing that happens in the gospel is Jesus reconciles with Peter. And that just reminds me of that. Peter did his thing. He lived out loud, and he made some mistakes, and he ended up denying Jesus in a way that seemed pretty serious at the time. And yet that relationship is restored in the end.
Right. That was not the end.
Yeah.
That was not the end.
I love that emphasis on the things that we see, the characters that we see who may appear as though they're not getting it, maybe the ones who actually are getting it most deeply. I love that.
Eventually. Yeah. Well, this has been quite an experience reading John. I've never read John before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
we're moving on next time to the book of Acts.
That's right. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 19a.
Which is the conversion of Saul, who becomes Paul.
Not a very creative name change.
No, it's actually we'll talk about this next time probably, but his name actually doesn't get changed in this text. It's just the Greek form and the Hebrew form of the same name.
Oh.
That's a conversation for another day.
It is. Well, it was lovely talking with you this week as always, and I will see you next time.
See you then.
Bye. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of BibleWorm. If you've enjoyed this free podcast, we hope you'll help us keep it going by joining our Patreon for as little as $4 per month. You can also sign up for other goodies like early access, video lectures, weekly liturgies, and more. Visit patreon.com/BibleWorm podcast for details.
BibleWorm is produced by Bobby Williamson and edited by Joel and Laura Becker. Our theme song is sung by Colin Bagney. We're grateful to our many supporters for helping us keep the podcast going. A special thank you to our executive producer, Fox Valley Presbyterian Church in Geneva, Illinois, and to our newest supporters, Sherry McLaughlin and Amanda Hecht.
Join us again next time as we move on to the book of Acts with chapter 9, verses 1 through 19a. Until then, keep on digging.